I am training hard and I want that extra 50 or 100 calories. I don't know, whatever it is. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Truth Talks, the podcast that brings you real strategies for sustainable fitness transformation. And sustainable fitness transformation is really about kind of like the everyday, right? But we also know not every day looks the same. So I'm going to start off with this for you, Paris. Are you training today or is today a rest day?
I trained earlier today, yes.
You trained earlier today. Do you have any rest days coming up?
I have a rest day on, I can take it either Thursday or Friday, so it depends.
Cool. So there is a rest day in the books. So on your upcoming rest day, either Thursday or Friday, are you planning on eating differently than you are eating today? Like, is there anything different, makes those days different for you?
Nope, they're pretty much the same. Even I keep my meal timing relatively the same, just to remove any decision fatigue.
You're just like locked into your routine, right? Some people might be wondering, is Paris doing it right? Is he doing it wrong? Should he be eating differently on his rest days? Well, we're going to unpack that question today, not just specific to Paris, but in general. Today's question is, should you eat differently on your rest days? Because we know training is demanding and we often think of food as fuel, but does that mean on rest days we need to be scaling back? And so that's the topic that we are going to be unpacking today. Do we want to do a short answer off the top before we dive in? Do we want to give away the answer?
Sure. The short answer is you don't need to eat differently on rest days than you do on your training days. That is a short answer if you guys are impatient, but I would highly recommend still listening to all the context that we're going to provide as well.
Absolutely. So no, do not eat differently on your rest days. And we're going to explain why, because that's also a little bit of a generalization, but there is good rationale behind it. Before we dive into the reasons why, though, I want to talk first about like why would anybody even be thinking about this question? Mm-hmm. Like, why are people considering eating less on rest days? And I think there's a few reasons. The first one is really just a misconception around how we use calories, and this idea that so many of our calories get used for training or working out that if we're not working out, we don't need calories, so we restrict. I think that's reason number one, and we're going to unpack that misconception today as part of our reasons why you shouldn't be eating differently. Reason number two is, Paris, I know this irks you so much, so please feel free to jump in on this one. Reason number two why people think they should eat differently on rest days. Have you ever used MyFitnessPal chronometer? Have you ever seen what happens with their calorie recommendations?
Yeah, oh yeah. If you put in exercise, then it like, oh, you can eat an extra 250 calories today.
So. Exactly. So it shows you this like always fluctuating from one day to the next calorie equation or calorie intake level recommendation that's based on like how much you worked out that day. So then by definition, the inverse of that is, oh, I didn't work out today. The calories it recommends you are lower.
Yeah. That's why I tell people don't even put your exercise into the app. It doesn't matter. Yeah.
So that's number two kind of misleading misconception of like why people think they should eat less on rest days. And the third reason is the historical diet culture has really created this sense that we need to earn our food. Mm-hmm. So if we're not working out, we haven't earned it. And there's so much like mental strife that comes with that. And there's a lot of like unhealthy, negative thought process and negative psychology associated with that. But I think we'd be remiss if we explain all the reasons why you shouldn't eat differently without actually first addressing the reasons why people do think they need to eat differently on rest days. Any of those points you think needs a little bit extra attention?
Definitely the difference in expenditure between rest days and training days. I think that's something I definitely want to make sure we hit home.
Okay, so we'll definitely unpack that. So if you're somebody who has felt before like, hey, I'm not burning as many calories today because I'm not training. Hey, my calorie tracking app is telling me to eat differently on rest days. Mm-hmm. Or, hey, diet culture told me I need to earn my food. This is the episode for you because we are going to bust down those misconceptions as reasons why you should eat differently on rest days and turn all that around and prove to you exactly why you actually shouldn't be eating all that differently on your rest days.
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do it. Okay, so you said you really wanted to make sure we give attention to this idea of like how many calories we're burning on rest days. Let's first start with unpacking calorie requirements on a rest day compared to a training day.
Yeah, so they're not that significantly different from each other. Even if you do a very intense leg session, there's not that much extra expenditure compared to a rest day. Yes, there is some expenditure that's going to be elevated from that, but I think people greatly overestimate that amount And I've said this on previous episodes where I think we've talked about these concepts before on like what burns calories in a day, right? So definitely go back and watch one of those episodes. Maybe we can link that one top here. But I think we got to remember when we're training, it's not an additional amount of calories. It's the net difference of what we're doing when we're training versus what we would have been doing if we weren't training. If I go in and lift weights for an hour, maybe for that hour I would have been going grocery shopping or I would have been chores around the house. So it's not like the additional expenditure is the entirety of the workout that's going to give us that level. It's like the difference between what I would have been doing otherwise and then the workout expenditure.
Right. So if we were to like put that into numbers, and do not pay any attention to the actual numbers I'm about to say, please.
Just the theory, yeah.
Just the theory. Let's say me sitting here working at my computer, in an hour I burn 100 calories. And then me going grocery shopping, in that hour, maybe I'm spending 150 calories. If I was training, maybe it's 250 calories. So instead of thinking I burned 250 calories extra from my training session, I actually burned 150 extra versus if I had just been sitting at my computer working, or maybe 100 extra versus if I had gone grocery shopping. So that's first and foremost, is the difference in the activities that you're doing is not quite as much as you probably thought it was.
Exactly right. And then secondarily is weight training doesn't actually burn as many calories as people think it does, even though it feels very exhausting. Think about it, how long your set is actually. It's not that long. So the total time that you're actually pushing yourself in terms of expenditure is not super high. We've already busted myths previously about why we're not trying to lift to burn calories. We're trying to lift for strength, muscle growth, and all those types of things. But I think it's really important to note that even if it feels challenging, the expenditure from weightlifting is really not that significant.
Yeah. And to your point, we take rest times in between and all that. So it's not like this consistent, like all the time you spend in the gym is all weight training. I think the third thing I'm going to add here in terms of understanding calorie expenditure is, we've said this before, and as you said, I'm going to link all of the related episodes in the descriptions here. 70%, roughly, it varies by person, but let's say in general, around 70% of the calories you burn in a day are just from you existing. So even if we take activity levels out of the equation, we're not thinking about how we're spending our time, the majority of your calorie needs are just baseline existence from one day to the next. That doesn't change. It's not like I grew a foot overnight, or I all of a sudden gained or lost significant amounts of weight, or I aged. All those are factors that affect your calorie requirements in a day. Those things don't change from your training days to your rest days. So we need to think first and foremost about acknowledging the fact that the strongest majority of our calorie requirements as individuals is just to exist, and that's consistent from one day to the next.
Yeah, just like bodily function, keeping the lights on, I like to say, breathing, heart beating, organs going, like all those things, that it's such a large portion of the expenditure. And then, to feed into the next point is like exercise, maybe 5 to 10% of that, depending on the person as well, like exercise induced expenditure. So it's like, okay, that's kind of a small proportion compared to just existing, right? So it's really, again, it's just really not that significantly different in terms of a rest day versus a training day in terms of a calorie expenditure standpoint.
Yeah, exactly. Let's just let that sink in for a second. If we were thinking about, do I need to eat differently on rest days? And we're defining eating differently as calorie amounts, calorie values. I think we just gave you a few good reasons why we don't need to eat that differently. The other thing I want to address is when we talk about eating differently, there's a few other components in that. And the first one I think is protein, right? You don't need to eat more protein on the days you train. So if you're thinking about the other aspects of like, checking your nutritional boxes on like rest days versus training days, your protein intake should also be fairly consistent. And same thing with things like micronutrients, fruits and veg, all of those things, macros, carbs and fats, they comprise calories. So when we're saying your calories don't need to change, there's a little bit more nuance to those ratios and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I think if we're thinking about other important nutritional variables like protein and nutrients, we also don't need to change those.
Yeah, just way overcomplicating things with very, very like limited reasons why, essentially.
Ultimately, like, your protein requirements are based primarily on your body composition. Mm-hmm. And again, that doesn't change from one day to the next.
Right.
Micronutrients, I don't even think I have to say this, is like, you need to take care of your health every day, right? Yeah. Not just on training days.
For sure. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay, so we just addressed that the number one reason why we don't need to eat differently on rest days is because our calorie requirements are not quite as variable as we might think they are. So let's go back quickly on our misconceptions around why people think they need to eat differently. It's either because they think they're burning more from exercise, so they eat differently. We just busted that myth of like, it's not significant difference. Two would be, diet apps, things like that, tracking apps showing you differences in your net calories, but oftentimes those are overestimated, and the science of like why we don't need to eat differently and what our actual calorie burn amounts are should be what we're sticking to. And then I think that diet culture of earning your food is more of a mindset shift than anything. But the way that we can work around that is just anchoring ourselves in the facts of like, this is how I know my body burns calories. Therefore, I need to continue to eat these calories. So again, number one reason why, I'm going to say this one more time because it needs to be out there. Number one reason why we should not eat differently on rest days is because our calorie expenditure is not as variable as we think it is, and because other nutritional requirements like protein and micronutrients for health remain the same. There are, however, though, a lot of other practical reasons. Like, it's not just about calories in, calories out in this sense, right? Because, there's some people who might be, I am training hard and I want that extra 50 or 100 calories. I don't know, whatever it is. But there are a lot of practical components involved with planning out your nutrition strategy. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to dive into now the practical side of why it just simply doesn't make sense to try to eat that differently on rest days. Do you want to give us the first reason why?
It's funny because typically people that ask, should I eat less on rest days, are beginners. And then beginners are also people that should be worrying way less about these things, because the primary thing in your nutrition is keeping it as simple as possible and trying to just get consistent. And when you're now eating differently on one day to the next day, and you're using like non-linear kind of strategies for your diet, we'll call them, where you have fluctuations in your daily intake, targeted fluctuations, it's like we're just making things very complicated for pretty much no reason. What really matters in terms of calories is like, we can think of it as a weekly calorie balance that we're trying to skew in either direction. But I don't like to go like super high on one day, super low day on other days for, in most contexts, especially for beginners, just unnecessary complication. And we're trying to build routines, and it just makes things more frustrating when you're building routines, and it builds friction when you're building routines. So definitely keeping it consistent will be beneficial.
Consistency is the goal, especially if you're starting out and you're trying to learn. Yeah. Like, if you're now all of a sudden, like, this is like me going to university and saying, okay, today I'm going to major in poli-sci. Tomorrow I'm going to major in marketing. The next day I'm back to majoring in poli-sci. Then the next day after that, I'm in marketing again. I'm not going to be able to actually effectively learn the course material for either one of those disciplines. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that's the same thing we have here. Let's say you're a beginner, or anybody, and you're training 3 days a week or 4 days a week. And then all of a sudden you have to learn, oh my God, I need an entirely different structure for this day than I do for tomorrow. Then you're not going to be able to be consistent on either one.
Yeah.
Versus if you keep things the same day after day, you're creating patterns, and you're giving yourself the ability to be consistent, generate momentum, learn what works, adapt from one day to the next based on what you learned the previous day. And let's also just say, like, if one of the key skills is like meal prep, meal planning. Imagine now you had to double everything because you're prepping for 2 different types of day for the week. It's just not practical.
Yeah, more barriers to consistency, which is the last thing we need.
Exactly. Well said. Number one practical reason. The number one reason was the calorie stuff overall. Number one practical reason is trying to eat differently on rest days is a barrier to consistency. You did touch on something as well that I want to bring up again, which was this idea of a weekly average. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit more about why that matters more than daily fluctuations?
Yeah, so it just makes things simple, and it also makes you less obsessed with like one day to the next. If you went a bit over in one day, if you look at your calories in terms of weekly average, then it really doesn't make that big of a difference, and it kind of makes these little things seem less like a big deal in your mind. And that's why sometimes I like to like zoom out and look at things as a weekly calorie average, and then we can see, okay, where are we netting out for the week instead of on a given day. But don't get that confused with, oh, I'll just go super high in one day and then super low. I'll just go super low in the other day. I don't like to play that game. Only with more experienced clients that I know have a really good relationship with food. Maybe we'll play a little bit of that calorie borrowing, I call it, but only maximum up to maybe like 15, 20% of calories. And I really don't like playing that game. Again, unnecessary complication. But I more like looking at weekly average in terms of, it's not a big deal if you want to be over one day or a bit shy on one day, as we'll look at calories on a weekly average.
Right. And so I think that can help you mitigate that idea of like, okay, I trained today. I was really hungry. I ate extra. Tomorrow I'm resting. I now have to restrict, right? That's not the mindset that we want. But what you're saying is, if people can zoom out and look at those weekly averages, it might help them say, you know what? Okay, I'm not going to force eating differently, but I also don't have to stress about it if it
Yeah.
might happen a little bit naturally.
Yeah.
Cool. Another very, very practical point, practical but also goal oriented, is calories have a very important purpose on rest days still.
Mm-hmm.
And so not only is it that, okay, keeping the lights on, as you said, that 70% that just keeps us going, but we also can't forget that rest days are just as intentional sometimes as our training days. And therefore, the way we eat also has to match that intention. And what I'm getting at here is recovery, right? Recovery. Because if we are really depriving ourselves on rest days, because I'm like, oh, I didn't train, I'm going to eat 500 calories less.
Mm-hmm.
Well, those 500 calories less now aren't being utilized for either muscle repair
Mm-hmm.
or muscle growth
Mm-hmm.
or energy levels. Or now maybe I'm also less inclined to have energy to do things like go for a walk around the block and find other daily movement that still matters, right? Anything else you want to talk about, like the intention? I'm going to turn it to you. Go ahead.
Yeah. It's not like we on the training days are the only days where our body is recovering from. It's like we're stimulating, recovering in that one day, and then that's it. The time course of recovery is, let's say even up to 72 hours in some case. Don't quote me on that, but it's extended way more than you think it is, and all those things that Courtney said need to recover. Also, like your glycogen stores, so that the next day of training is better. Is not just the rest day itself. Like, let's say I completely underfuel on my rest day, and then I have to go hit a heavy session the next morning. I
Where's that
completely
energy coming
underfueled.
from?
Where's the energy? And then my performance is less, and my results are going to be worse, right? So I think it's really important to again see the bigger picture and not look at these so tiny time frames and use like skewed logic. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think sometimes too we forget that 24-hour clock is a little bit arbitrary,
Yeah.
right? Like
Sure.
if I'm, some days I might train later in the day, some days I train in the morning. But think about it this way, okay? If I'm training an evening session, and let's say that evening session is 6 p.m., okay? And I considered my breakfast at 9 or 10 a.m., and then I had my lunch, then the difference between like my first meal at like 9 a.m. and my 6 p.m. training session is, what is that, 9 hours, okay? If I eat dinner at, let's say I had a late dinner at 9 p.m., and then I was like, I'm going to have a 6 a.m. training session.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same amount of time in between sessions
Yeah.
that we're fueling for.
Yeah.
But now all of a sudden, because it's past midnight and the calendar's turned over a day, we think it's entirely different.
Exactly. Yeah.
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 So
just always keeping the bigger picture in mind with these things.
Mm-hmm. Rest days, intentional eating for recovery, repair, growth, and fueling subsequent training sessions. So there's still a purpose to the calories you're eating beyond even just the keeping the lights on stuff.
Yeah. The other thing I do want to add is sometimes, let's say you're in a fat loss phase, for example, sometimes training is a little bit of a distraction and it keeps you busy and it tends to, in the short term, acutely blunt appetite too. So me sitting at home twiddling my thumbs on the couch versus me training, which version of me is going to be thinking more about food? So if you're now have this extra gap where you're not focused on training, which might eat up a decent period of time, and now we significantly reduce our calories on the day, you might be looking at the cupboard like, oh, that's attractive. So it's like
the cupboard or the things in it.
Well, you might think both, depending on how hungry you are.
And depends on how your interior design looks of your kitchen, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just something to think about on that is like another like small nuance point that some people report.
So you're essentially, if you are in a fat loss phase and you are trying to reduce on rest days where you have more time to think about food, you're making it harder for you to actually adhere to your plan.
Yeah.
Harder in terms of both stressful and harder in terms of adherence might actually suffer. You might not actually be able to. Yeah. There's a lot of reasons why we shouldn't eat less on rest days.
Mm-hmm.
However, I also want to address that there's always nuance to these topics. Every single topic we cover in this podcast has more nuance than we can cover in 30 minutes. But we'd be remiss if we didn't actually talk about maybe specific instances where it does make sense to eat slightly differently on training days versus rest days. What would those be?
Absolutely. I think the first one is just in terms of appetite regulation. Like some people get very hungry from training. So it makes adherence a little bit easier if you're like, I'm really not hungry on my rest days, but I'm starving on my training days. Well, okay, then maybe it makes sense to put a little bit more of your
Mm-hmm.
food on the training days just to make adherence easier and just go with your natural appetite cues. I think that's like the first main one, just to make things easier on you. The second is in terms of preference. Like if you're like, hey, I'd rather, get to have that extra food in my post workout meal on my leg days or something like that, something to look forward to or whatever, then okay, if that's your preference, and again, if we still meet our weekly calorie balance, awesome. Like there's no harm in doing that. Again, I just don't like making drastic swings between the days if we're playing that calorie borrowing. Um,
Can I interrupt you for a second?
yeah.
Because there's one common theme to both of those two rationales. The
Mm-hmm.
first one was appetite management, and the second one was preference.
Yeah.
Both of those are reactive strategies. They aren't proactive strategies. And I think this is a case where being reactive is actually more beneficial than being proactive. Because if you're sitting there going, okay, I'm going to eat differently for arbitrary reasons or for reasons that have nothing to do with me or for any of the misconceptions we talked about up front, then you're sacrificing essentially the practicality perhaps with this like arbitrary reason to eat differently across training days and rest days.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have the experience that tells you, oh my God, my appetite soars on training days, or you know what, I genuinely love having a few extra carbs in my post workout meal, it
Mm-hmm.
feels really satisfying, and that's preference, that's reactive. That's actually knowing how to move through your fitness journey in a way that's personalized to you, which is the
Yeah.
goal.
Yeah.
But it's not sitting there making these decisions without any sort of rationale or in ways that are generalized and have nothing to do with you.
Exactly. It's essentially just your awareness develops as you get deeper into your fitness journey, and these little nuances you might find work better for you, and it just makes the journey smoother. And okay.
Yeah, but it does come from that experience. And at that point where you have that experience and you've done a little bit of trial and error, you're also not necessarily having to worry about, oh my God, okay, I don't know how to eat from
Yeah.
one day to the next. I don't
Exactly.
have the skills and structure to be consistent, which was one of the practical barriers, right?
Yes. Yeah. There's a saying: keep it stupid simple. Especially when you're first starting out, the simpler the better. Then you scale the complexity.
Mm-hmm.
But I will remind people, the most advanced people still have the most basic programs. Like I always crack up when people say, "Oh, this is too basic for me" or something like that. I'm like, we have people that are like at the highest level of physique competition that are doing pretty
Mm-hmm.
much just as basic as you.
Yep.
Anyways, so it's just funny, right? So just again, keep it stupid simple, then add complication later. But complication in air quotes is only based on your subjective feedback of you learning your body. Then you can address these details and nuances to make it smoother for you. Only once you've collected your own data. Yeah.
Yes. The complication, or I'm going to actually replace it with the word complexity.
Yeah. Complexity. Yeah.
Complexity is not for complexity's sake. It's in response to awareness development.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Yeah.
that's how I would summarize it, right? It's knowing more of, okay, what works for me? What do I need? And it's that heightened sense of self to guide your journey. And that's where you add in the complexity, because you still stick to the basics. Like those don't go away. You still
Mm-hmm.
stick to the basics and the fundamentals, but you're then just layering on.
Exactly. And I do want to say, like, one other reason why you might adjust, and this is not necessarily rest days to training days, but it can be, is I do play with kind of high days and low days for people that are a bit more advanced, but b getting towards very lean body comps. Because when you're very lean and have been dieting for a long time, the pre-workout meal can actually make a significant difference in how you feel and your performance. If you're just starting your fat loss journey and you're carrying a lot of body fat, these things don't really matter. If any of you have been deep into a diet and have gone very lean, you can, if you have like a big bowl of rice before your training session, you're like, whoa, I feel fantastic, this is great, light switch is on, let's go. You know what I mean? So if that's the case, then maybe we could logic saying, because of that perception, and that it will make your training session easier and potentially performance would be better, maybe we will play with a little bit more food on that day. But then on the flip side, you say like, okay, well, on your rest day, if we fueled up more, we'd promote relaxation, maybe a better night's sleep if you're super lean, and then also now your glycogen stores are then better and more full for the subsequent training session, so the performance might be better as well.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. So there are reasons to eat maybe a little bit differently between rest and training days if you are exceptionally lean and you are chasing long-term stretched out fat loss goals. And that is strategic. But again, it's very personalized to those situations. Exactly. It's also a response to either how their training performance feels or how their recovery feels. So once again, their response techniques too. And I think instead of saying, hey, we're taking away from rest days, in those cases, you're thinking about how am I adding to either my rest days or training days to get more. Yes. So it's thinking about it through the enhancement rather than the reduction.
Yeah. And let me boggle some minds for a second. When I got to my leanest last year, my 2 higher calorie days were actually on my 2 rest days.
So mind boggled.
So I have 4 really hard training sessions and 5 low days during the Monday to Friday, and my Saturdays and Sundays would be my high days, and most of the time I wasn't training on those days. So then I could start my next week really ready to go.
Yeah, you felt rejuvenated, right? Mm-hmm. There's a psychological effect to that too. And also, sometimes those days tend to be more social. If you're hanging out with Tara or something, maybe you want more space to do social 100%. Things. But again, curated for you, response to what you know works for you. Mm-hmm. So it is really important to learn more about your own variables as the journey goes along if you are considering those things, right?
Definitely.
I just want to drop one quick fact before we actually wrap this up. And it's in response to what you're saying about let's say you're somebody who the training boost feels really good if you have a bowl of rice or something. We do also need to contextualize what that actually represents in terms of calorie variability. Mm-hmm. Because I think if you're going to have a bowl of rice, let's say it's 1 cup of rice is probably about, depending on how much you're having, let's say 30 to 50 grams of carbs. Mm-hmm. Okay. And that's about 120 to 200 calories extra. Mm-hmm. So we're not talking about these major swings either. So I just want to drop that for context of when you're talking about these little additions of things that can subjectively have a purpose, there's still not major swings in your overall calorie intake for the day.
Yeah, not necessarily. Or even on a refeed day, your refeed day might be 300-400 calories more, depending on the context. But yeah, and again, I really, for most people, don't try to play the game of I'm eating less here and more here for, again, skewed logic. It's only subjective feedback in unique situations and scenarios where these nuances can make a difference.
Absolutely. Okay. So it wouldn't be an episode of Truth Talks if we didn't wrap it up with a specific mindset shift.
Yeah.
And here's what I'm going to go for.
Yeah.
Your rest days are not a break from your goals. Your rest days are part of your strategy. Mm-hmm. And you need to see them as such. And you need to understand the intention behind them. And that will help you see the benefit in fueling effectively on your rest days as well. Awesome. No need to draw it out further than that. I think that summarized it.
So we'll let everybody go get back to resting.
Yes, please go rest. Or if you're training, go train hard so you can rest tomorrow. Or whenever your next rest day is. Yeah, because mine's not today or tomorrow. So it'll come Thursday, Friday. All right, everybody. So without further ado, the quickest answer to the question of should you eat differently on your rest days is no. You probably shouldn't. With a small asterisk, if you are basing your decisions off of your subjective experience, it's a response to your own personal journey, and you've thought it through as to what the intention is. But generally, no, please do not go eating all that differently on your rest days.
Perfect.
All right, everyone. So we'll leave you for this week. We will drop a couple of links to the related episodes here in the description below, because I know we hinted at a few different themes across this episode that we have actually touched on before, more in depth in the past. So you'll see those there. And if you have any tips or tricks on what makes your rest days feel productive when it comes to nutrition, also please feel free to drop them in the comments. I know our community would love to read them. All right, everyone, without further ado, we'll leave you for this week, and we'll be back in your feeds next Monday with another episode of Truth Talks. Bye for now.
Take care.